Welcome to the world of horror and mystery, where truth blends with fiction and stories turn into vivid nightmares. Before we begin our terrifying story for tonight, don't forget to support us by clicking the like button, subscribing to the channel, and activating the notification bell so you can receive all new episodes as soon as they're released. Your presence is the secret to our continuity, and your comments fuel our enthusiasm to present more dark, nerve-wracking stories. Let's get started now. The sun was setting, tinting the sky a warm orange when the family arrived at the small village. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of fields and wildflowers, as if the place was meant to offer them a chance to rest after a long, exhausting life. The family consisted of the father, who had always dreamed of a quiet place to raise his children, the mother, whose eyes held a glimmer of hope despite the fatigue of the years, and the eldest son, Rio, a young man in his early teens, calm in nature but filled with boundless curiosity. Beside him was his little sister, who hadn't stopped jumping and laughing since she first set foot in the village. The villagers welcomed them with broad smiles. Some neighbors came out of their homes to greet them and offer their help carrying their luggage. Children ran through the dusty alleys, waving and laughing, while the adults looked at Rio with looks of welcome mixed with curiosity. One of the elders approached them, shook their father's hand warmly, and said, "Welcome to our midst. Your new home is ready, and you will find the comfort you are looking for." The house they were given was beautiful in its simplicity. White walls, old wooden windows, and a small garden in front. When they opened the door, the scent of wood mixed with the earth wafted in, bringing a smile of satisfaction to their faces. Their mother immediately began to organize their belongings. Their little sister ran to the rooms looking for her own place, while their father sat on the threshold, quietly contemplating the sunset. Rio stood in the center of the large room, contemplating the high ceiling and the quiet walls. He felt something strange touching him, not fear or anxiety, but a sense of belonging, as if he had known this place for a long time. That night, they gathered around a small wooden table and ate their meal amidst laughter and conversation about the future. They were happy, as if life had finally decided to give them a new beginning. None of them knew that this beginning would not be as they had hoped. Night fell on the new house and silence filled the room. The family was exhausted from a long day of moving and organizing, so everyone quickly fell asleep. Only Rio remained awake, his eyes fixed on the television shining in the living room, as if its light was dispelling the loneliness that surrounded him. He felt a kind of childish excitement. The house was new, the atmosphere was different, and he refused to waste the night sleeping. As the hours passed, the light on the screen began to dim in his eyes, and he began to blink more than necessary, but he stubbornly fought off drowsiness. When the clock struck exactly 3 a.m., a strange sound pierced the stillness of the night. A long, continuous whistle, sharp as an arrow, coming from outside. Rio shuddered in his place and slowly turned his head toward the window. He was sure the source of the sound was there. He stood up hesitantly and tried to open the window, but his hand stopped suddenly. the window was tightly closed. Here he remembered that his father had locked the door himself before going to sleep, insisting that no one should approach it. His heartbeat accelerated, and the whistling didn't stop. It became more and more pronounced, as if something was getting closer and closer to the house. He felt the air grow heavy, and the night around him was breathing with the mysterious sound. At that point, he had no choice but to head toward his father's room. He quickly opened the door and whispered, shaking his father's shoulder, "Dad, please wake up! Someone's whistling outside!" The father jolted out of his sleep, his eyes shining with acute anxiety. He sat up in bed as if he knew something he didn't want to reveal, then gripped his son's arm tightly and said in a firm yet trembling voice, Don't even try to open the window or even look at it. Do you understand?" Rio remained stunned, not understanding why his father seemed so scared. Seconds passed before the whistling sounded again, closer this time, as if someone were standing right under the window. The father gasped, pressing his son closer to his chest, as if forcibly preventing him from moving. He looked at the door and the distant window, as if darkness itself threatened him. Then, swallowing hard, he said, "Don't move. Don't you dare come closer. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, don't go near that window." His face was a mixture of anger and fear, his eyes wide and his hands trembling. For the first time, Rio felt that his father wasn't just protecting him, but trying to protect him from something he knew all too well, something lurking outside that window. And at that moment, the whistling suddenly stopped. There was nothing but dead silence, a heavy silence that seemed to portend something worse. Morning came slowly, but its light didn't bring peace to the family home. Rio sat in the corner of the living room, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness, his body exhausted from the long night, but he couldn't fall asleep even for a moment. The voices he heard, his father's terrified expression, and the mysterious whistling that tore through the silence of the night, all of it kept replaying in his mind like an endless nightmare. They gathered at the breakfast table, the atmosphere heavy with an eerie silence. The mother set the plates down casually, but her eyes were fixed on her husband and Rio. She looked at them in surprise, and then asked, in a voice she tried to make calm, "What's wrong? Why do you look pale, as if you just returned from a war?" The father raised his eyes to her hesitantly, then exhaled deeply, as if trying to expel what had been lingering in his chest since the night. He told her what had happened: an unknown whistle in the middle of the night, Rio's attempt to open the window, his warning not to come any closer, and the panic that overwhelmed him. His mother listened closely, and with every word her face shifted from surprise to concern, until the conversation ended with her staring at her husband with trembling eyes. "Are you sure what you heard?" she asked, clicking her fingers. "I'm absolutely certain. That whistle wasn't normal. It was coming from someone nearby, as if someone were standing right under the window." Rio listened to every word, his heart pounding, but he couldn't stop himself from thinking. Why so much fear over a mere whistle, he wondered, his confusion growing. He didn't understand the reason for this panic, and he couldn't believe that a sound like that could frighten his father so much. Suddenly, his curiosity drove him to do something he would later regret. He silently got up, pretending to go get something from his room, but instead headed toward the window. The window he'd been warned about, the window that was tightly shut. He reached out to examine it, and it was unnaturally cold, like a piece of ice in the middle of summer. He leaned closer, put his ear to the glass, and felt a shiver run through his body. There was another sound, not a whistle this time, but a low, intermittent whisper, as if calling his name. Rio! Rio! He retreated with trembling steps, his heart nearly jumping out of his chest, but something strange inside him compelled him to stay. His curiosity was stronger than his fear. He pressed his face against the window again. Suddenly, the bottle trembled as if someone from outside had brushed a hand against it. "Rio, get away from the window!" His father's scream was heard by the whole house, freezing him in place. His father ran over, grabbed his arm, and pulled him away. His eyes flashed with both terror and anger. "Have you lost your mind? Didn't I tell you not to come near?" Rio was confused, unable to respond. He was confused, torn between fear and curiosity. His mother stood there, pale, staring at them as if she couldn't believe what was happening in her new home. But inside her heart, a fire of terror began to ignite. This was no longer just a mysterious whistle in the night. It was something bigger, something lurking for her son. And from behind the walls, as if the house itself could hear them, the whistle echoed again, slower than before, but harsher, more insistent, as if it were an announcement that this house would no longer grant them peace. Night fell again, and the house was immersed in a heavy silence, as if awaiting something no one wanted to happen. Rio had made up his mind this time. He wouldn't let things go as they had on previous nights. Fear had crept into his heart ever since that unknown whistle began filling the house. Yet his curiosity remained stronger than his terror. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to uncover who was behind those mysterious sounds that robbed him and his father of sleep. Before everyone went to bed, his father had locked the windows and doors tightly. Then he put the key in a place no one knew about. Rio, however, was uneasy. He continued to watch his father's steps with wary eyes, silently following him like an invisible shadow. When he saw his father bend down slightly and slip the key under the bed in his bedroom, he held his breath to avoid being discovered. Then he quietly returned to his room, pretending to be asleep. He stretched out on his bed, but his eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the right moment. He heard his parents' breathing becoming heavier and heavier until they fell asleep, and the house fell silent. At that, Rio stood up on his tiptoes, walking slowly and cautiously, like someone walking through a graveyard. Every creak on the wooden floor was like a scream that might wake someone, but he continued crawling until he reached his parents' room. He entered like a ghost, the darkness concealing his features, and approached the bed. There, under a bed, his father and mother were deep in sleep. He bent down quietly, extended a trembling hand, and very slowly removed the lower cover. His heart pounded like the drums of war. His fingers grazed something cold metal, the key. He clutched it tightly, as if it were a precious trophy. then withdrew as he came, leaving no trace. He returned to his room, but he did not rest. He sat by the window, holding the key, staring into the darkness engulfing the village. He was waiting, anticipating that cursed whistle that only came with the deepening of night. A few heavy moments passed, then the silence was shattered by a long, sharp whistle from outside. His body trembled, yet he smiled nervously. This was his chance to find out. He hesitated for a moment as he put the key in the window lock. Was what he was doing foolish? Perhaps, but his curiosity was stronger than any fear. He turned his head toward his parents' rooms where they slept peacefully, then returned his gaze to the window. He caught his breath, slowly inserted the key, turned it, and a metallic click broke the silence. He felt something shift in the air around him, as if the entire house was listening with him, watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. With his hand on the handle, he heard the whistle getting closer, closer, until it seemed to be standing right behind the wall, only a step away. His heart thumped violently, and sweat dripped from his forehead. Yet he didn't back down. He knew that this night would be unlike any before it, and that what he revealed might be something he would regret forever. The night was heavy, and the house was immersed in a stifling silence, broken only by Rio's agitated heartbeat. He sat by the window, anticipating the damned whistle that had been gnawing at his nerves for days. His eyes were fixed on the darkness, as if waiting for something out of this world to emerge. Suddenly, the whistle rose again. It was long and intermittent, like wind passing through a torn throat. Rio reached for the key, turning it slowly until the window opened. The cold air pierced the room, carrying with it a foul odor of smoke, a smell like burning flesh. Rio raised his head, and at that moment his blood froze. There was a face, a hideous face, burned to the bone, with ash-black remnants of flesh hanging from it. His eyes weren't human eyes, but two glowing red dots, as if they had come from the depths of hell. The face slowly approached, pressing against the window pane, its burning breath covering it in a dark mist. Rio screamed with all his remaining strength, a scream that shook the entire house. His father rushed out of bed, followed by his terrified mother. He banged on the door, nearly breaking it open. He found his son lying unconscious on the floor, next to an open window, the key lying beside him. The father trembled as he grabbed the key and quickly closed the window, as if trying to block a gateway to another world. He stared for a moment into the darkness outside, knowing deep down that what his son had seen was no illusion. He turned to Rio's sprawling body, lifted him with trembling arms, and placed him on his bed. The mother in turn didn't say a word. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw Rio's face turn pale, as if he had lost a part of his soul. The father whispered in a low voice, filled with the certainty of someone who knew what was happening. "It's just begun. From this day forward, his life will be hell." The mother's heart trembled, realizing that the secret her husband had kept for years had now become a curse hanging over her son's head. That night, no one in the house slept a wink, except Rio, who lay in a cold coma, his nightmare deepening. Rio woke up with the first light of morning, exhausted as if his sleep had been nothing but a heavy coma. He opened his eyes to see his father, mother, and sister surrounding him with worried faces. He tried to get up, but the weight of his body nearly prevented him. His mother smiled faintly as she placed her hand on his forehead to reassure him, while his father watched him silently, a mixture of fear and sternness. However, in a fleeting moment, Rio's eyes caught something behind them. In the corner of the room stood that burning face, its eyes two ember-colored dots glowing in the deep darkness. The creature slowly raised its head and whispered in a hoarse voice, almost a whistle. "Behind you! Behind you!" Rio's blood froze as he screamed at the top of his lungs. His parents and sister quickly turned toward the place he had pointed to, but found nothing. There was only an ordinary wall through which the morning light filtered. They turned to him, confused, as he panted heavily, searching with his eyes for any trace of that face. When he looked again, he found no one. It had disappeared. Rio slowly got out of bed, sweating profusely despite the chill of the morning. His heart was pounding violently, as if it wanted to burst out of his chest. His father held his arm to reassure him, and his mother tried to calm him down, while his little sister cried out in fear for him. They all sat down for breakfast, hoping for some routine to ease the terror. Rio sat between his parents, his sister beside him, trying to catch his breath. But as he reached for the bread, he felt a heavy shadow to his left. He turned and saw the burned face sitting beside him, staring at him silently, its eyes burning without lids. Rio screamed again, and his father and mother rushed to grab him. "Calm down, Rio. Nothing. We're right here with you." But Rio saw only the terrifying reality before him. He tried to look away to convince himself he was imagining things, but instead he fell into an even greater nightmare. His mother, father, and sister were staring at him with strange smiles. Smiles that were too wide, stretched so tight that their faces looked like distorted masks. Their teeth stood out, shining white in a terrifying row, and their eyes were solid and unblinking. They smiled at him. They smiled the smile of death. Rio screamed as he backed away from the table, his chair falling to the ground. Their voices rose as they too screamed, but their screams blended with those terrifying smiles, as if they were screaming and laughing simultaneously. The scene was like a hellish theater, their voices piercing his ears, their smiles growing wider, until it looked like their faces might tear apart. And then, just as suddenly, it all faded away. The burned face was gone, and those distorted smiles were gone. Everything was back to normal, his family staring at him with genuine concern. His mother reached over to hug him, saying in a trembling voice, "It was just a nightmare. Rest assured, we're okay." But Rio, trembling like he'd just emerged from hell, knew deep down that what he'd seen was more than just a nightmare. Something was tampering with his world, something he didn't want to let go. Days passed, Rio living in a strange cycle of terror, until the face of the burning man visited him every morning, every night, and every moment of his day. At first, he would scream from the bottom of his heart, collapsing and trembling until his heart nearly stopped. But gradually, as the same scenes recurred, his body began to adapt, and his mind refused to surrender. Whenever the terrifying face appeared before him, he would simply stare at it for a few seconds, then turn his face away as if nothing had happened. He no longer screamed, no longer collapsed. He even began to convince himself that it was no danger as long as the entity didn't directly harm him. He said to himself, smiling a despairing smile, "As long as he doesn't lay a hand on me, I'll just treat him as a passing shadow. I'll make his presence normal." And so, Rio began to live his life outwardly calmly. He sat with his family, laughed with them, shared his food, and everything seemed to return to normal. Sometimes, when the burned face suddenly appeared, he would turn away and continue talking to his parents or his little sister, as if he hadn't seen anything. But deep down, the fear remained burning like an inextinguishable ember, a repressed fear waiting to explode. One cold winter night, around 3 a.m., Rio suddenly awoke to a deafening scream, a scream that pierced his inner silence like a knife through tender flesh. It was a familiar scream, the sound of the burned face that had accompanied him for so long. He sat up in his bed, his eyes wide, his heart pounding. He slowly turned to his feet, and there he saw it. But what he saw this time was unlike the previous times. It wasn't a burned face smiling a distorted smile. It was a whole body, a tall, terrifyingly thin creature, its skin taut over its bones as if it had just been buried. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers dragging along the ground like claws. It crawled with slow steps, its voice a metallic creak filling the room, and its sunken eyes emanating a stifling darkness. Rio stepped back, gasping, but quickly froze. The entity was no longer a motionless face. It was a creature moving toward him, creeping step by step, its foul breath filling the room, and its sunken eyes emanating a stifling darkness. Rio stepped back, gasping, but quickly froze. The entity was no longer a motionless face. It was a creature moving toward him, creeping step by step, its foul breath filling the room. The entity stepped back, gasping, but quickly froze. The entity was no longer a motionless face. It was a creature moving toward him, creeping step by step, its foul breath filling the room. The panic this time wasn't like before. It wasn't fleeting. Rio felt as if this entity was approaching, heralding a new phase, one in which it was no longer just a shadow appearing and disappearing, but something lurking, stalking, and perhaps about to touch him for the first time. His whole body trembled, and a voice inside him shouted again, "It's not normal anymore. Everything has changed." And so, that night, Rio realized that his previous insensitivity had not saved him, but had been a trap that had driven him to surrender, until he allowed the horror to transform from face to body, from ghost to creature, crawling toward him in the darkness. The night was heavy, and the house was suffocatingly quiet, as if time had stopped inside. Suddenly, a muffled scream erupted from Rio's room, a scream that shook the walls and woke everyone in the house. Rio was lying on his bed, his body writhing as if he were being dragged into dark depths that no one but him could see. The creature reappeared. It was no longer just a burned face or a crawling shadow, but a long, gaunt body, its skin cracked and charred like a mixture of ash and charred flesh. Its sunken black eyes glowed with a red gleam, and its voice was distorted and deep, as if the earth itself were speaking from within. It approached Rio, then raised its long hand, its sharp fingers resembling rusty claws, and began to strike. Each blow tore at his skin and opened a new wound until blood soaked the sheets. Rio was screaming hysterically, his voice echoing through the room and crackling against the walls. Strangely, despite the pain, he couldn't move. It was as if his body had frozen or surrendered completely to this nightmare. The creature began to repeat incomprehensible, inhuman words, interspersed with creaking sounds and a cold metallic echo, until Rio felt his brain itself ignite from the sheer volume. It wasn't just a language, it was a curse that stuck to his soul, digging a wound deeper than any stabs. The creature struck and struck until nothing remained of Rio but an exhausted body covered in blood. Then, as the creature raised its hand for the final blow, Rio felt his breath being ripped from his chest. Suddenly, his screams stopped, and his eyes widened in absolute terror, as if the moment of the end had arrived. At that moment, his family stormed into the room after hearing the commotion and screaming. The mother, father, and sister all rushed in panic to find Rio lying on the bed, gasping for air. But what they saw next was even more horrifying than death itself. Rio's body began to disintegrate before their eyes. His skin was peeling off his bones as if wax were melting under an invisible fire. The flesh of his legs and arms fell in rotting pieces to the ground, and his face gradually faded until only his bare skull remained. The mother's scream pierced the night sky throughout the neighborhood. The father froze, while the sister collapsed to the ground, hitting her head with her hands in horror. The neighbors woke up in a panic and rushed into the house, only to find the same scene: a skeleton on the bed, blood and melted flesh scattered everywhere. The creature disappeared, nothing left but the heavy air and a burning smell filling the room. The police arrived minutes later, took the body, or rather the skeleton, and transferred it to the forensic department. After hours of examination, the report came out. The cause of the dissolving flesh is unknown. There was no trace of chemicals, no heat, and no scientific explanation. The house was plunged into a funeral silence. The neighbors had been talking about the incident for weeks, and the entire city was shaken by the news. But what no one knew was that the creature that had ended Rio's life hadn't really disappeared. It was patiently waiting for its next victim. The family has been drowning in grief since Rio's passing. The house is no longer the same. A heavy silence suffocates the walls, and the sound of the mother's crying echoes every night, waking the father from his sleep. The little girl stares into space with glassy eyes, as if she no longer understands the meaning of life after losing her brother. One evening, the mother sat at the table, silently preparing dinner, her hands trembling as she cut the bread. Her husband sat beside her, trying to hold herself together. The little girl played on the floor, drawing blurry lines on a blank sheet of paper. Suddenly, an eerie silence fell. A cold feeling swept over the room, as if the air had been cut off. The mother slowly raised her head and saw what she had never hoped to see. Rio. He stood there, a few steps away, his face pale and his eyes sunken, but his smile, an unnaturally elongated smile, so wide it seemed to tear his face apart. His body was solid and motionless, but his gaze was fixed on them, devouring them with fear. The father gasped and slumped in his chair. The child froze. The mother's hand caught the knife, and the loaf of bread fell from hers. They didn't scream at first, they just recoiled, stunned. But Rio began to move. He took a step forward, then pulled something metal from his pocket, a sharp knife. He slowly raised his hand, the smile never faltering. With an inhumanly cold movement, he placed the knife against his throat. He began to cut, very slowly, as if savoring the moment. The blood flowed first, then he deepened the cut until his head was half detached before he fell to the ground with a dull thud. The head rolled back, his smile still fixed on his face, while the body stood for a few moments without a head. Then, like a puppet with its strings cut, the body fell beside the head. But it didn't stop there. His body suddenly began to burn, a strange black flame consuming him until he was completely gone. Nothing remained of him, neither flesh nor bone, only a suffocating smell of burning and the echo of unbearable silence. The mother screamed and fell to the ground unconscious. The father gasped as if he were suffocating. The daughter covered her eyes, trembling violently. But before the whole scene could disappear, a mysterious voice echoed throughout the house, a deep, distant voice, as if originating from the bowels of the earth or from an unfathomable void. When the dead smile, the night splits itself in two. What fell is not a body, but a covenant. Whoever saw the blood melt, let them wait for the wind to return, for the doors have not closed, and the final scream has not yet been heard. After those words, an eerie silence fell, and then police sirens began to sound in the distance, piercing the air of the quiet neighborhood. But something in that house had changed, something no one had seen. The walls still echoed with laughter, and the air still carried invisible ash. As for the family, they no longer knew whether they had truly said goodbye to Rio, or whether he was still there, waiting. This was our story for tonight. A mysterious and terrifying tale that leaves behind unanswered questions. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will greatly support us in continuing to present more breathtaking stories. Share this video with your friends if you dare, and let us know in the comments what was your most terrifying scene today. Until we meet again in a new story, always remember, darkness conceals more than it reveals.